Well, hello and welcome to Polity Matters Called Meeting. These called meetings are periodic shows that allow us to distribute bonus content to you, our dear listeners. Interviews, ramblings, special topics, you'll find it all in this occasional format. These called meetings will also transform you listeners into viewers. We'll be posting these extra episodes on our YouTube channel as well as our regular podcast feed. So if you're getting this particular show as audio only right now, be sure to check out the show notes where we have a link to our YouTube channel, and you can come watch our smiling faces as we work through this extra material. On this edition of Called Meeting, Jared's sitting down with teaching elder Adam Parker to discuss an article that he wrote for Presbyterian Polity in early October 2023 entitled Tension in Our Polity, A History of the Assistant Pastor. Thanks for listening and for watching. Enjoy the show.
Well, welcome to Polity Matters. This is one of our special type of episodes that is called the Called Meeting, where we either talk to somebody that is a churchman of interest or somebody that has written about something that may be of interest to our audience. And today we have with us a pastor in the Pacific Northwest, PCA pastor Adam Parker. Adam recently wrote an article that was published on Presbyterian Polity, that's pcapolity.org, but on assistant pastors. But before we get started into the content of what we're going to be talking about there, Adam, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you, where you grew up, are you married, do you have kids, all those fun details.
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest, specifically Kansas. I lived within 100 miles of the same place, actually like 50 miles of the same place my whole life until I went off to college. So just right in the middle of the state of Kansas. When I think of home, I think of wheat fields. I have to say that because I went to school in RTS Jackson, and people in the Northwest think that I'm a Mississippian. It shocks me because you can hear my voice. I don't hear any Southernism in my voice, but they hear it. So you got to make sure everyone knows. No, I did not grow up in Mississippi. I grew up in Kansas.
You're definitely not from around here, that's for sure.
Yeah, where are you at, Ben?
Mississippi Delta, Cleveland.
Yeah. I wouldn't fit in there. They would immediately be able to tell by my Converse sneakers and my voice.
We'd hear you coming a mile away.
Yeah. But I grew up in Kansas. I came to faith. But I was a teenager who went to church. I lived in a church-going family, but I became an atheist when I was pretty young. The 10-second version is that the Pentecostals tried to get me to speak in tongues at summer camp, and they pressured me enough that I faked them. And I left that summer camp basically like, wow, everybody here is just making themselves believe that God is real, and he's not. Because if he was real, he would have made me speak in tongues, because I heard how hard they were praying. So I became an atheist. I was probably an atheist for the next 3 years. Like, I wouldn't say I didn't go to the meetings because they didn't have atheist meetings in Kansas, but I still went to church, but I didn't believe any of it. Basically, the short version is I read apologetics works by various authors and eventually came to Christianity in the nerdiest way possible. So I just was persuaded that it was true, and that's how that happened.
How did you wind up in the PCA and get interested in Presbyterian Polity after you tell us about your wife?
I married my wife when I was 19. We were both 19 years old, pretty young. And we from the beginning, she thought she was marrying a Wesleyan. She thought she was marrying a Nazarene, and actually I became a Calvinist while I was in college and became extremely irritating to those around me. I passed through those years. She eventually came on board, but it probably took 4 or 5 years before she was on the same page as me. But I was really early on very persuaded that I believed in the Westminster Confession of Faith. I love the Westminster Confession of Faith. I just needed to find a church where they believed it. And in the middle of Kansas, that was hard. So long story short, we found a PCA church that we had to drive about an hour each week. But we got plugged in. We were part of it. The church recognized my call, sent me off to sent me off to seminary, and really the rest is history. I love the PCA, and I'm in it because I believe that we have a great confession and we have a great denomination. So
Where'd you go to seminary again? I just want to make sure I caught it.
RTS Jackson.
Yeah, okay.
So
That's what I thought.
Well, let's go ahead and jump into it here. You wrote an article on assistant pastors. A little bit of a warning here. You're talking to two people who got their starts as assistant pastors.
So if we had a time machine, we could go back to the 1973 General Assembly, give a stirring speech, remove the assistant pastor from the BCO, and by the laws of Back to the Future logic, neither of you would exist right now.
No, we would fade from the picture slowly. Yes.
Okay.
But tell us a little bit, actually, before we get into the details of how this came into the PCA. What is that? For some people, assistant pastor, associate pastor, they're synonymous in their mind. What's the difference in PCA polity between an assistant pastor and an associate pastor?
Yeah, the answer to that's found in Book of Church Order 22. I'm not going to read that, but the simplest answer is the assistant is called by the session of the church and the associate is called by a congregation. And so effectively that means that a congregation votes for its associate pastors, and a congregation doesn't vote for those assistant pastors that serve in them, over them.
And that seems a little strange, because even as we've already gone over in our podcast, preliminary principle number 6 talks about a society calling anyone that's an officer that's over it. Even BCO 16.2 talks about that there's no man should be placed over a church in any office without election. So how did this get into the PCA's BCO? Like, why do we have this strange anomaly of an assistant pastor?
Yeah. I was initially interested in this, and I did some Google searches online, and I couldn't find any telling of how we got the assistant pastorate. And so I started just reading the old assembly minutes for myself, just so I could figure it out. If I could boil down the narrative, here's what we have. The PCA is formed in 1973. When we're formed, we come from the PCUS. When the PCA adopted its BCO, and I'm using all this slang terminology because I assume that I can use acronyms here, and we're not explaining it for everybody. Whoever's listening to this is really in for it already.
Yeah, Baptists are completely lost by now.
Yeah, they're totally, and that's actually what we want. We actually want them to be lost. So when the PCA adopts its BCO, it basically took the 1933 BCO from the PCUS. They give it a few tweaks, but basically the version that we adopt in 73 has the assistant pastorate. But the thing is, the version that we adopted it from didn't have it. And so I'm going to admit that there is just this massive 40-year gap in what I could figure out, because I did as much research as I could before eventually we were just like, you know what, we have enough information. But I would love to still, if there's a listener who knows the story of how we got the assistant pastorate in the PCUS between 33 and 73, I would love to know. Because I couldn't find old BCOs from the PCUS. When I did my research, man, there's like a brick wall somewhere. I don't know if those things are still copyrighted or what, but they're very hard to get to. And so effectively though, here's what I think we can piece together. The practice of having assistant pastors starts sometime after 33. And so when the PCA is born in 73, they have to insert a provision for the assistant pastor, because enough churches are doing it that you need a way to account for them. And so that's why we have assistant pastors in our BCO, because it was already the practice when churches came in. And so in some ways we have assistants because during the time when the PCUS was increasingly liberalizing, it adopted this new practice, which we have now inherited. And maybe most interesting to me, or at least one of the interesting things to me, is that in the 80s, the PCUS does away with the assistants. It removes the position. So we can talk about this later, but from the very beginning in the PCA, there are people who they want to take that seriously, this seeming contradiction between the principle that you were mentioning in 16.2, this principle of congregational consent and the office of assistant. But of course, those voices in that movement didn't prevail. And even today, then we still have assistant pastors.
Yeah. And actually, I might skip ahead to just ask then, are there other Reformed or Presbyterian denominations that have this idea of an assistant pastor?
So I do catalog a little bit in the article what I was able to find of other Reformed denominations, and the answer honestly is that in terms of Reformed denominations, not very many. It looks like, when I was able to just do broad searches for assistant pastors online, you have a lot of Baptist churches, congregational type churches, who they have a position of an assistant pastorate. But the PCUSA doesn't have assistant pastor anymore. URCNA doesn't have assistant pastorate. The OPC has no assistant pastorate. The PRC, no assistant pastor. ARP, no assistant pastor. RPCNA, no assistant pastor. What you do find in some church denominations that have them is, like, the EPC has an assistant pastor, but it's called for a definite period of time, and so they have to keep renewing it. And actually, I suspect that's closer to, probably, we need to talk about this, so I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I think that probably is closer to treating the assistant like an intern, which I think is how it originally really was in the PCA. So you do see it in a few denominations, the RCA, EPC, and the ECO. But even the ECO at least has a provision that lets the congregation vote on the assistant if they want.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Why would this position have come about? Like, what were the advantages of, instead of having, a congregational meeting and calling an associate pastor if you need a second or third pastor, that the role of an assistant pastor might have come about? What's the advantages of that?
So the practical role that assistants played in the early years was training and preparation. So this need always existed in the church. The Scottish churches had this practice they called probationers. And so a probationer was someone who was given pastoral responsibilities. They'd be told to read scripture. They would even occasionally preach. They were brought on and they were released by the session of the church, not the congregation. And so the idea was, these guys need help to develop their gifts. And if you went to the congregation and had them vote on this guy who has not been developed and he hasn't had opportunities to be tested, they might vote no. And then the poor guy doesn't even get a chance to be tested, right? So you want to give somebody an opportunity. So you could see how even in our denomination, then, you want a way to train guys up. You want a way for guys to get practical, actual experience in the field. And so, the position, what it did was, it let a session recognize a man's need for training and bring him on staff without the congregational drama. And then, in theory, he's not supposed to be doing this for too long. And so it also allows them to quickly and easily release him when it's time for him to go. And so, I think one thing that to me, at least, the more I study this, the more I was like, wow, our internship now really is what the assistant used to be.
Yeah. That's how it was for me. Is that what it was for you, Ben?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other ways that you've seen assistants used in Presbyterian polity? That may have been the original, but are there other ways that they've been used that you've seen?
So I would love just experientially, I'm happy to hear from you guys as well, but it does seem like the way that it's used now doesn't resemble the way it was originally used, because now there's probably a diversity of practices. So this is not, sort of a one size fits all story or narrative here, but it does seem like in the PCA, you have guys that get hired on as assistants for long periods of time, years at a time. And it's mainly because I think there is a desire, either on the part of the session, to have it be easy to hire and easy to fire, or how do I put this delicately? Sometimes senior pastors can feel threatened by associates, and it's nice to have the guy as an assistant, because the thought is he's never going to be a threat to me.
Yeah, I think you see that more at larger churches where there's like 6 or 7 assistant pastors. The the session has a little bit more of a rein on them. So that might be something that happens. It's hard to call a congregational meeting with a large church too. So sometimes it might be seen as, well, we don't want to call a congregational meeting. We'll just have the session call them. But you were talking, Ben, to people doing church planting. Have you seen assistants used as church planters before by churches?
Currently our church here in Cleveland serves as in a mother-daughter relationship with a church plant in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and we have called an assistant to our church in Cleveland, who we've tasked to go live in Jonesboro and minister there, with the intention of it being somewhat short-lived. That, Lord willing, in the next 12 to 18 months they'll particularize and he'll be called by that congregation as their minister. So we're using it in that way. We just interviewed Ben Coppers and Matt Bradley not long ago. You don't see a lot of second teaching elders involved in a church plant, but on occasion you will. I know that Matt kind of worked that way when he was planting outside of Nashville. I don't know if they called him as an associate or an assistant when they called their second guy about a year into planting. But yeah, I mean, it certainly has benefits, I think, that it's easy to get a guy on the ground if you call him as an assistant, especially if he's not going to be serving over the congregation that has authority over that particular congregation. I don't know if that doesn't make sense. The way that we're doing it, it wouldn't make any sense for us to call the guy as an associate to our church to go work somewhere else, because he's not going to have any disciplinary authority over the people in our congregation either way. And so calling him as an assistant was easy and made a lot of sense for us.
Yeah, we've had, I've seen it used before too, with somebody that's maybe not going to be there a long time. Maybe they're in their retirement and they're just going to serve a few years, or they're a chaplain somewhere. So I've seen it used for a lot of different things. It's interesting. You're basically saying that it originally started off almost like an internship provision, but it's been used for other things. But another thing I found interesting in your article was learning that we didn't have an internship for the first 10 years. So what was the deal with that, Adam?
So yeah, the first 10 years, I mean, we'll think about it. It's a fledgling denomination. We're just glad to be meeting. We're just glad that we're together and that we are no longer part of the PCUS. Like, there's some celebration going on there, and everyone's just keeping their head above water. One of the things you start to feel when you read the minutes of the original assemblies is, oh my goodness, these guys are trying to do everything on the floor. There's so much work going on that sometimes they would just stop and say, hey, we'll pick this up next year. And so originally, the way it looks is you have this probationary period for these guys. For the first 10 years, the practice is going on, but almost immediately after the new denomination is born, right? The denomination's born in 73. In 74, they have their second General Assembly. At that second General Assembly, they form a committee. The committee is not formed to deal with assistant pastors. The committee is actually formed to deal with the question of how many offices is the PCA going to be? Are we going to be a 2-office church? Or are we going to be a 3-office church? And as they're putting the committee together, someone on the floor makes a motion and says they also need to consider the question of assistant pastors and whether that fits in the PCA. And the group consents, and so they are tasked additionally with that question. And so for the next...
So wait, ahead. So you had, you listed some of the people that were on there. Do you remember some of the people that were on that committee?
So the committee ends up changing over the years because they keep coming back and saying, we're not ready. They keep coming back and saying, we need more time. We need more time. So, at one point, though, if you'll let me just summarize a little bit, the committee's got R.C. Sproul on it. R.C. Sproul's on it for a number of years. Don Clements is on it for a number of years. Ligon Duncan II, not Ligon Duncan III, the chancellor of RTS, but his father, the ruling elder Ligon Duncan, he is on the committee at one point. Kennedy Smart is on the committee. Mickey Schneider, Morton Smith, all of these men at one point or another are on the committee. And of interest to us, now I love the debate over 2 or 3 office. And in fact, when this committee is bringing its report each year, that's what everyone's interested in. It doesn't look like anyone's interested in the assistant pastor conversation at all. Everyone wants to know, what are we going to say about 2 and 3 offices?
Yeah. Didn't you talk to some people that had been there? And that was kind of what they were saying?
Yeah. I mean, barely anyone remembers the conversation about assistant pastors. I've probably talked to half a dozen guys now who were at those original assemblies, and all anybody remembers is talking about the 2 and 3 office view. So everybody's talking about 2 and 3 office view. And these guys from the very beginning, though, as soon as they bring their first report, they say, we aren't ready. But the one thing we are ready to say is that we shouldn't have assistant pastors. Like that's their first report to the General Assembly, is saying our report is totally incomplete except for this one piece that you should know. And then the next year they come back and they say, we're still not ready, but we're still recommending the removal of the assistant pastor from the Book of Church Order. And every year they reaffirm that. Every single year they bring their report. And now they keep adding to the committee. They keep wanting to increase it. They want to put historians on the committee. They want to, they really want the best committee that they can. But remember, what's everyone focused on? 2 and 3 office debate. They're not focused on the assistant pastor. So in some sense, the assistant pastor, I think, becomes a political piece in how they get the 2 office view through. If you can get the 2 office view to prevail, and yes, you have to sacrifice maybe the assistant pastorate in the floor debates, and the big churches want to get rid of it, then you might let that happen just so that you can get the real outcome that you're looking for, which is the 2 office view. I think that the debate over the number of offices ends up really being what it's all about, and the assistant pastorate gets forgotten, but they never stop recommending its removal. Yeah.
And it was the bigger churches that didn't want to get rid of it. And do you think it's because of some of those reasons of getting a new guy in there and having a congregational meeting? And
so we have very little actual record of the floor debate. And in fact, we have no record of the floor debate. Everything we know about floor debate ends up being this. We know that Sam Patterson made a motion to remove that recommendation about the assistant pastorate from the report. And we know he was at First Pres Jackson, which was a prominent, important, large church, even at that time in the PCA. And so what we don't know is who else was supportive, who else was against it. But we know that the majority ended up going with Patterson's motion to remove it from the BCO. Some people who were there remember a speech basically speaking along the lines that there's a need for men to be able to come easily and to go easily, especially in the training process. So even in the floor speech from Patterson, if what I heard was accurate, then even then he was saying we need guys to be able to come and go easily. And that doesn't seem to describe the practice of what we have in the assistant pastorate today. It does very much fit with the idea of it being about the internship, practically, at least the internship.
Yeah,
like there's a need for guys to be released without a ton of drama, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, it seems like a lot of this is about the principle of it, the fact that the congregation is not calling the assistant pastor. Mm-hmm. But do you think that just to play devil's advocate a little bit, like the fact that the congregation doesn't actually take that vow, do you think that takes care of that problem or not? And if not, why not?
I mean, the fact that the congregation doesn't take a vow of submission to the assistant pastor, right? The session has vows that they make to the assistant when they're installed. The congregation doesn't. I think it actually, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because it makes it hard for the assistant to preach and teach and administer the sacraments. It makes it hard for them to counsel or effectively serve, because he's basically serving a congregation that has not taken that vow. At the same time, right, the fact that the church doesn't take these vows doesn't mean that therefore the man isn't effectively serving over them. And so in some sense, right, they haven't made vows, but he's still in effect serving them. He's still preaching the word. He's still administering the sacraments. These are all exercises of authority. And the man is still called their pastor. So it's a little bit like trying to sort of like, in my mind at least, it's sort of like done with a wink and a nod, right? The man is serving as pastor, but he has no authority. And we tell ourselves that, but the ministry of the word comes with tremendous authority. So there's a little bit of, you're asking this man to actually do the thing where he exercises serious and important authority. and without your consent, basically. So
Yeah, I think you're getting to some of there's even some things with the assistant pastor himself that he doesn't quite have the job security that you do when the congregation calls you. There's a little bit of so what authority do I have? Which does seem a little strange, since the office of elder assumes some sort of ruling to have that tension that's there.
mhm.
So, but don't we need something in which you have something of a probationary period? Would you have a lot of people not called if they don't have this kind of probationary period? What about that as a pushback to the pragmatic part of why you need an assistant pastor?
Yeah, when I was in seminary, I served as an intern and was able to gain experience during that time. And admittedly, some churches don't have paid internships. I didn't have a paid internship because I couldn't score one of those. I wanted one real bad, but not everybody has a paid internship. But I would have been very glad to do that. And I think there are a lot of men who, in that what you think of as probationary period, would be very happy to be paid during that time. And if you've got a church that's willing to pay, and they're willing to pay a man to serve them during that period where he needs to be trained, the internship fits that perfectly. I mean, the existence of the internship, it almost sounds like a description of the internship, to be honest. But what happens, though, is in the PCA, when those debates are happening on the floor, Sam Patterson makes that speech. And, I think it's important that we don't think of him as like some radical pragmatist or something. He is serving at a time and speaking during a time when we don't have the internship yet. Internship doesn't become the part of the PCA until the RPCES comes in the 80s. And one of the things I point out in the article, or at least I suggest it somewhat, is that might have been the right time for us to reevaluate the assistant pastorate. But we've had
it with us for like 40 something years. So why do you think it might be a good time to reevaluate or to think about these issues again?
To me, at least as I've been working on this and as I've been thinking about it, in some ways we're getting further and further from that first generation of men who really remember these things and remember some of the things that mattered, who remember what life was like in the early days, getting the PCA going. To me, at least, partly, I see a value in addressing this now rather than when it's a distant memory or when it's only a matter of the history books. Partly because our history books say so little about this. But I've had quite a few old timers, and hopefully they don't mind me saying that, first generation men who have reached out to me after they read this article, and to a man, I've not gotten anybody yet writing to me that's passionate about keeping the assistant pastorate. To a man, they tell me that this was something that's really important, that they really do think it's an inconsistency at our polity, but it was also something they didn't have the energy to address back in the 70s. They were just trying to get things going, get it off the ground. And if there's if some churches really, really, really want this, then they were okay with sort of saying, fine, you can have it. But I do think that, it's possible that to be honest, I didn't really time it this way. This is just when the interest in the subject came up for me. But I think that there might be a willingness for us to think about it, because now we've got 50 years of the assistant pastorate to look back on. And I've heard from quite a few guys who've served as assistant pastors that they see the weakness of the way that they were serving too, and that they really don't think that it's a healthy thing for the denomination. I didn't take that angle in my article, mainly because I never served it as an assistant. We don't have an assistant at our church. We don't plan to hire an assistant. And I don't have a history with it where I could say, oh, look at this experience. This was really terrible for me. But I do know guys who, if you asked them, they'd probably write that article where they would say, like, this is a reason why, practically speaking, it's not a good idea. I think there are also guys that would say this is great, and I actually can think of practical ways for it to be addressed. For others, though, it's just simply the principle of the matter that these guys serve without the congregation's consent, and that needs to be repaired somehow.
Well, you end the article with several different ideas about this is something of an inconsistency within our book.
Mhm.
the fact that you're supposed to call somebody from the congregation, or with their consent. But you have a lot of different ways of, maybe from best case or to other ways to solve this
Mhm.
inconsistency. What are some of those ways that there might be some solutions to this if somebody wanted to address this in our book?
Yeah, I tried to think through what are the logical possibilities. I really didn't want this to be an advocacy piece. I'm talking more in those terms here. But I really wanted to just bring everyone's attention to this because I think that it's not only is it just interesting, but I think the fact that the committee, was so consistent about its own recommendations to me made me go, wait, maybe we should look back at this. We're divorced now from the political moment where they're trying to figure out this debate over the number of offices. Maybe we can go back and actually give this have a real conversation about it. But in terms of logical possibilities, you could tighten up the language of 16:2. Right now it says no one shall be placed over a church in any office. Like that's the language, in any office, without the election or at least the consent of that church. And the last time I checked, the assistant pastor is an office. So like we definitely have, I use the word tension. I'm tempted to use the word contradiction. Something needs to be cleaned up there. You could change it to be really specific, right? You could change it so that instead of having a blanket negative, you could just change it to something like no man can serve as a ruling elder, deacon, senior pastor, associate pastor without election or consent to that church, right? And then you just conveniently leave out the assistant pastorate, and boom, you've built yourself a beautiful loophole for the assistant pastor to exist. I mean, that is an option.
Mhm.
But I still think it's a problem because I think it effectively misses preliminary principle 6, and I think it still doesn't get to the heart of what Presbyterians have always wanted, which is congregations need a say. So, but that's one possibility. Another possibility is that it stays in the BCO, but it's just temporary, right? You do something sort of like the EPC has. I'm more in favor of that than I am in doing nothing, only because it gets you back to the old style of what it was, which was an internship. Because if you have a period of time attached to it, then at least it looks more like an internship again. But it still leaves you going, well, why don't we just call this an internship and remove it? I think effectively you still end up with that.
Adam, what do you
Yeah.
do? Let's presume that we can pass this, right? We can. I mean, I suppose I'm giving away my position a little bit.
Mhm.
We take assistant pastors out of the book. What do we do with all the current assistants? I mean, because you can't just automatically transition them to associate ministers because you're seriously stripping away the right of a congregation, right? You're actually forcing someone on them that they have to submit to. What do you do with all these? I mean, I don't know the numbers. How many assistant pastors are in the PCA, right? There's probably a ton of them.
I'm guessing all it takes is an email to the admin committee at the GA level, but I didn't do that, so Jared's going to fire that email off right now while we're talking. Yeah, I mean, effectively, it would take time. I know that when I was looking at the PCUS, it was really interesting to see how they did it. It looks like every year they would come back and they would report on the number of churches that have addressed the assistant pastors among them. By the way, I don't normally look to the PCUS to see how they did things. But, in this case, since they did exactly what we're talking about, it's of interest at least. And it looks like they did it over a number of years. So they basically set a timer, as it were. And they say, beginning in this year, we're going to be asking churches to address the assistant pastors and whether they want to bring them on as associates or whether they want to simply hire them as paid staff. And by I think it's like 3 or 4 years, they have a certain date where they need to have done it. So the congregation still has something that it has to do. It still has a say. The session still has to be involved and have a say. But the question is, where does this guy go to? If he's effectively serving as a minister, he's administering the sacraments, he's doing all the things that you would expect a pastor to do, then by all means, he should have proven himself to that congregation by now, and they should be able to transition him to an associate, have a search committee formed, have a vote, and follow the way that our BCO sets it. The harder one is guys that maybe they're not really serving as ministers. They're instead they're more like paid staff. And I think those individuals could become paid staff. They could still retain their ordination, but and I'm just thinking creatively, maybe they're serving out of bounds or they're serving without call in those situations. But there's somewhere for all of them to go to, but they're at least they are moving into more clearly defined roles. But I think a lot of the guys who are assistants would become associates eventually.
Yeah, there's some provision for those that had retired, I think, as ruling elders, and whether they get a vote on the session. Yeah. And it used to be that they did. And then when they took that away, they actually grandfathered anybody that was before this date could do that. So maybe that would be part of it too. But I also think of, I'll just share our own experience. I had a problem with this principially about as a principal. And then our church wanted to call somebody, but we knew they'd only be with us for about 3 years because it was at the end of his retirement from being a missionary. And I advocated for associate, but my ruling elders wanted assistant. And I lost that debate. But at the end of it, I just asked at our next congregational meeting, can we just have a vote by the congregation to affirm the session and calling this man? Just because I wanted there to be some consent of the congregation to the fact that we're bringing somebody on. And they threw me that bone to do that. So I don't know if that, if that would have been cited, if they saw that in our records or anything like that. But I thought it was at least something where, if you have this as a debate within your session, that might be at least something to kind of keep that principle alive there. Mm-hmm. So anything else you guys wanted to, else you wanted to ask Ben, or anything else you wanted to comment from your article, Adam?
I don't think I have anything I'd add.
I just really appreciate you taking up this issue and making it known. I mean, we've only recorded episodes on 9 chapters of the book so far, and probably in over half of them, something about the assistant pastor comes up, because in the beginning of the book, we're dealing so much with the preliminary principle number 6 and election of elders and, oversight and everything. This is a significant issue. That principle sort of having this tension or contradiction, as you said. Mm-hmm. Or maybe you didn't say contradiction. You were tempted to say contradiction.
Anyway. See, when I say I'm tempted to say something, it's a way of saying something and not saying something. It's pretty close.
Not that I would ever say
I recommend everybody try it.
Certainly would never say it. Anyway, really appreciate you coming on talking about it. It means a lot.
Yeah. Well, as we prepare to end here, we did have one more set of questions, and that is our lightning round. Okay. And I have my own set of lightning round questions, and I had listened and that Ben had a different one. So I don't know if we should kind of pop in and go back and forth or something like this, but these are just questions that are this or that. And so actually I may start us out and then see if Ben wants to throw his own in there. And
I have nothing in front of me. I'll just have to wing it, I guess. All right.
Yeah. So this will just be this or that. What's that?
Just for all of us?
Just for you, buddy.
Just for you, Adam. So this will be, is it this or that? And you can explain your answer or just give us the answer, and then we'll move on. So you can pass if the answer would incriminate you in any sort of way. So I'll start off pretty easy. Hodge or Thornwell?
Hodge. And that's just history, because it was the very first systematic theology I ever read. I was still an Arminian at an Arminian school, and I found Hodge and read him. So that's just history for me right there.
So it's less his polity than his getting his theology.
Yep.
That'll make Ben feel a little bit better.
It's a sentimental choice. And yeah.
All right. Did you have one, Ben?
Oh yeah, we can alternate. Toilet paper over or toilet paper under?
Oh, it's gotta be over you gotta be able to grab it from the front.
That's right. Yeah. We're Presbyterian. Yeah.
Yes. This is one that is especially good for you, Adam. Marvel or DC?
Well, DC comics, Marvel movies. Ooh. Although not anymore. Now I don't. I'm just checked out on Marvel. Right. It's too much. I've just had too much.
Mine have a theme. You'll notice. Toilet paper or bidet.
Well, I'm not Canadian, so toilet paper.
All right. Wine or grape juice?
Wine.
Associate pastor or assistant pastor?
That's a tough one. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna go associate.
Okay.
All right. Superlapsarian or infralapsarian?
Infra.
Interesting. Got another one.
I know
Ben?
I sound more hardcore if I say Supra, but I'm Infra.
Star Trek or Star Wars?
5 years ago, I would have said Star Wars. Now I'm tired of Star Wars, just like Marvel. So I'll say Star Trek just because, yeah.
You're not sick of it yet. Yeah.
I'm not sick of it yet. Yeah.
Yeah. Pipe or cigar?
Pipe. My wife doesn't like what I smell like when I smoke a cigar. So she's fine with how I smell after a pipe.
You have any more, Ben?
I don't think so. My brain's mush.
Is it pronounced GIF or GIF?
I say GIF because it's graphic interface file, so I have to just think that the hard G stays.
And the final one, we actually had talked to somebody else that's in your presbytery, former moderator, Howie Donahoe, and asked him which is the preferred way to say it, like within a meeting, call the question or move the previous question.
I only ever hear call the question. But if someone's trying to show off or be fancy, they'll say move the previous question. But then everyone goes, wait, what was the?
Yeah. Is it all the
they think a lot
or,
longer.
Yeah.
It's like saying I would not never do that. You know, you just make everyone in the room stop and freeze and yeah. Call the question. Right. So much better.
Well,
what did Howie say? Do you remember?
He said it didn't matter.
That's such a Howie answer. That's so good.
All right. Well, thanks again, Adam. Is there anything you want to plug or anywhere you want people to either read your stuff or listen to anything?
I don't write very often. Every time that I write, it's because I have a project that I'm really passionate about and I've spent months on it. So I think it would be bad if I was continually churning out stuff. Actually, I used to churn out stuff and it was not all good. So you could read my article at PCA Polity. I would love to plug those guys. I think they're great. I don't know who runs it, but they're all right. And we do have a church podcast. It's called the Evergreen Beaverton Podcast. We do it mainly for our local congregation. I could imagine somebody wanting to listen in on it or give it a chance. So if so, then have a go at it. Yeah. And then I would also say if somebody lives in the Beaverton, Oregon area, please check out our church. It's Evergreen Beaverton. If you just Google that, you'll find us, but it's evergreenpca.com. So
yeah, it's close enough to be near Portland and all the interesting things there, but far enough away that you're fairly safe. So
yeah, I mean, we don't get firebombed, not yet at least, but
Good. All right. Well, thanks a lot for having us. And Ben can add any kind of final details if he wants to at the end of this.
Well, thank you for joining us for this installment of Called Meeting. If you're interested in learning more about anything that we addressed, check out the show notes in your podcast player or at politymatters.org. If you enjoyed the show, consider following us on Twitter and Facebook at Polity Matters and subscribe in your podcast app of choice. If you have questions or comments, you can contact us at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com. A special thanks to Adam Parker for joining us on the show today. He serves as pastor of Evergreen Presbyterian Church in Beaverton, Oregon, and he's also the host of the Evergreen Beaverton podcast. Scott Edberg is the senior minister of Providence PCA in Troy, Illinois. You can find him on Twitter at @sedberg. Jared Nelson pastors New Life Presbyterian Church of Hopewell Township in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, and he's on Twitter at Brother Nelson. My name is Ben Ratliff, and I serve as the associate pastor at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Cleveland, Mississippi, and I'm on Twitter at _Ben Ratliff. Thank you again for spending your valuable time with us. Y'all take care.